towards something more like a La Nina, but I think nothing like as profound a one as we saw a few years ago. So I don't think we should get too apocalyptic about these climate scares. That's a game that Obama and the international socialist communist left like to play. They're the ones who have the most to gain by whipping up these really rather childish scares about man's influence on the climate. And the fact is, the climate has always changed, is always changing, and will always change. Humankind has very, very little to do with it. And you can certainly, the one thing you never need to worry about is the thermohaline circulation or the Gulf Stream stopping. It can't. And even the climate left admits this. Carl Wunsch, for instance, who is one of the arch true believers in the new religion of apocalyptic global warming, even he has admitted quite plainly and publicly that as long as the wind blows and the Earth rotates about its axis, the Gulf Stream will flow. So don't worry about it.
Now, here's a question for you, Lord Monckton, is why did they come out and say the coldest winter in 1,000 years? Was that to advance their agenda? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm not sure who is saying this.
That was the London Telegraph. The London Telegraph actually came out with a piece on that.
They now have a series of lunatics, the London Telegraph, writing their environmental stuff. I mean, there are two of them whom I know personally. One is Geoffrey Loon, whom I've known for about 40 years. He's the environment correspondent. He's always been mad, and he's always been potty, and everything is doom and gloom and disaster and apocalypse. And in the old days, that used to sell newspapers. Now, people are getting very tired of it, and people are cancelling their subscriptions to the Telegraph because it's like the clock striking 13. Everything else in the Telegraph seems sensible. Then you come across Geoffrey Lean's column, and you realise the whole paper's gone a bit mad. And there's another one called Louise Gray, whose one belief, she has no religion, but her one religion is that it's all mankind's fault. And she writes these bleating columns every day, announcing some new disaster attributed to man's influence on the climate. She has no critical faculty. She has no scientific knowledge. She just produces this drivel day after day after day. And the trouble is, we are now governed and run by a managing class, including presumably the editor of the Telegraph, whoever he be, certainly somebody very undistinguished, that simply have no scientific knowledge. And so when they get so-called specialist correspondents who write this drivel, they do not have enough intellectual strength or knowledge to tell them not to be so stupid. So you're getting a lot of stuff in the news media which is howlingly irresponsible. Yes, we've had an early and cold start to the winter here, certainly in northern Britain, just in the last day or two. But that's weather. That's what happens from time to time. We live quite close to the North Pole. If you get a good strong wind from the Arctic at this time of year, you'll get snow. It's happened before. It'll happen again. It's nothing unusual. It's not going to be any more desperately cold than it's been, let us say, if we go back 300 years to the time when, for 70 years, between 1645 and 1715, there were virtually no sunspots. For 70 years on the face of the sun. That led the Thames to freeze over every winter, and the Hudson in the United States, in New York, to freeze over every winter. And they've never done so since. Although, admittedly, a few years ago when I used to live on a leaky old barge on the Thames when I first moved to London and couldn't afford a house, I remember large ice floes coming past my boat being carried down the Thames towards Hampton Court in a very cold winter we had then. But these are, again, natural events that come round from time to time. And the idea that we're going to get even colder winters than when the sun turned itself off for 70 years is simply wildly improbable and has no respectable scientific basis. And these are the very people who only last year were still telling us, as they had been for the last 10 years, that global warming was the global crisis. Now they're saying it's global cooling. Well, come off it. We can't have it both ways. Interestingly, though, now that global warming has become unfashionable and global cooling seems to be becoming the rage, I notice on the agenda for the Bilderberg Group's meeting, that's the transatlantic leaders meeting that happens around May every year. This year's Bilderberg Group had on its published agenda no mention of global warming, but there was a mention of global cooling. They discussed that, and why did they discuss it? I'll tell you why. Because it was I, among others, that made sure that got onto the agenda. And the reason is that global cooling, if it were to happen, and of course I can no more use a crystal ball than anybody else and say it's going to, what we can say is that global cooling has a far more drastic, profound, and damaging effect on life on Earth than global warming does. We are warm-blooded creatures. Plants like a certain amount of warmth. That's why they all grow in the summer and shed their leaves in the winter. Every living thing on Earth, on the whole, prefers warm to cold. And so if it gets colder, that is what would cause real damage worldwide. And quite rightly now, the more responsible and thinking world leaders are once again remembering why it is that warm periods in the recent history of the Earth, such as the Bronze Age warm period, the Minoan warm period, the Roman warm period, the medieval warm period, and the best of the lot, the Holocene warm period, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, all of which were considerably warmer than the present, were known to climatologists as climate optima. Warm periods were good, cold periods were bad. Now we are relearning this elementary truth, and it means, of course, that the scare stories, which were of global cooling 30 years ago, then they became global warming. Now here we are back at global cooling again. The fact is this: the climate will change unpredictably in one direction or another. Neither I nor anyone else can tell you whether the climate will be warmer or colder than today in 50 or 100 years' time. It could be either, and it's 50-50 either way. What we can say, though, is that if it gets a lot colder, which it may or may not do, that's a lot worse than if it gets a lot warmer. My guess is that it won't change by more than 1, perhaps 1.5 degrees Celsius in either direction, and therefore it will fall well within the long-term, well-established natural variability of the climate. And therefore, although there will be many extreme weather events, because there always have been, there are no more now than ever there were, and therefore there will still be people dying as a result of tornadoes and floods and hurricanes and plagues and droughts and all the other things that we've seen. These will continue just as they always have since 4,567 million years ago, since that Tuesday when the Big Bang happened. These things will continue, and we will continue to have to live with them and do our best to protect against them. But it's better to prepare against extreme cold than extreme warmth, because extreme cold does harm, and extreme warmth, on the whole, doesn't.
You know, I have to differ with you on one thing you said, and that was that all creatures on the planet prefer warm to cold. You haven't met my wife.
Not all. I said in general.
You haven't met my wife yet. She is one of them that really likes the cold vice the warm. But that's about the only one I can find. I know myself. I always favor the warmth of the sun to the cold or the chill of a winter's day for sure. But you said one thing that my partner John here has a very keen interest in, and that's Bilderberg. Isn't that right, John?
Absolutely. Lord Monckton, you mentioned Bilderberg, and for those of us that are awake and in the know, you can go on the Internet and type in a Bilderberg guest list and come up with a 2008 or a 2006 guest list for that Bilderberg meeting, for which I've done, and I found that many of the big corporations in the world attend this meeting, one whom is Coca-Cola. They've sent representatives to the meeting. And recently, Max Kaiser from MaxKaiser.com in Russia Today has mentioned that if you take a corporation such as Coca-Cola and you attack its stock and bring its stock down to zero, whether it take a month or a year, just drive the stock to absolute zero, the status quo will change, and that will truly be revolutionary, and not a shot will need fired. Would you agree that if the people of the world got angry enough and took the companies that are attending these elitist ruler meetings and attacked their stock and drove it into the ground, that we would actually have true revolution in this world without actually firing a shot?
Well, since I have attended some of these meetings of world rulers myself in the past, when I used to be more active in that kind of politics than I am now, I don't want anyone revolting against me or my class, for that matter. And I think one can get a little bit too overexcited by meetings such as the Bilderberg Group. Yes, they're a pretty pompous lot. They're a self-selected oligarchy of people who, most of whom actually don't exercise any real power in the world. A lot of them are retired or failed politicians. On this year, for instance, Shirley Williams turned up, a messy baroness from the House of Lords, from the Liberal Party. She was one of the four who broke away from the Labour Party to found the new Liberal Party, now in coalition with the Conservatives. She is a relentless opponent of democracy. She spoke, and most venomously spoke, and voted against giving Britain a say on whether we continue to belong to the European dictatorship, which really is dangerous and really does exercise malign power, taking our democracy away. People like that tend to go to these meetings, but do these meetings actually exercise any power over the world? No, of course they don't. I know from having gone to them, they're talking shops. They're there mainly to make the often failed leaders who go to them feel just a little bit grander, to be reminded of what it was like when they were taking part in intergovernmental conferences around the world. And some corporations are allowed to come to the table as well, and some church leaders, and, a sprinkling of this and that. Just the great and the good chatting among themselves. There's the Davos World Economic Forum. I've been to that. There are various conferences organized by everybody from the United Nations to the CIA. I've been to those. And the fact is that the world's governing class likes to talk to itself over the heads of and behind the backs of the people. And the way for the people to change that is not to try to go for revolution, because it's always the people that get hurt in revolutions. The governing class largely escapes and merely becomes a new kind of governing class. The way to organize a real revolution, as I've said, is step one of my program is sound money, which I've already talked about, how you get there, the talent. Stage two is to start making sure that governments are also brought down to size. We first of all bring banking down to size by starting with the currency and having that in the hands of numerous small but efficient and properly supervised currency boards. Then you do the same with governments, and you say, right, the kind of rampant overspending that has been going on will have to stop, because the only people who profit by it are the bankers and the people who are rich enough to loan governments money. And governments must, in future, only be elected in those countries where you still have the right to elect those who make your laws. We don't have that right in the United Kingdom anymore. We can elect who we like, but the people who make our laws are the unelected commissars. That's the official German term for the people who run the European Union. They are not elected by anybody. They can issue directives which have the force of supreme law throughout Europe, regardless of what we or any parliament we elect, whether the European or the national parliaments, have to say about it. Those directives have the immediate force of supreme law throughout the European Union. We don't have the chance to elect our real governments anymore. In the United States, you do. In Canada, you do. In Australia, you do. In New Zealand, you do. In Britain, we don't. In Ireland, we don't. But in most of the English-speaking world, you still elect your governments. And while you do, here's a very simple rule. This is step 2 in my program for recovery. You must only elect a government that promises not from year 5 or from year 10, but from year one, that it will balance the budget. It will not spend more than it takes in tax.